I read The Cider House Rules by John Irving recently with Janelle from the Page Turner. We read this together. She posted a review of it a few days ago, and I will post a link to her review in the description of my video. But this is a novel that I had heard the title of before. It was adapted to a movie a few years ago. I have never seen the movie. I knew very little about it going in, just that it had something to do with abortions. It started out strong. I started out liking it. Then it took a turn for the worse about halfway to 3/4 of the way through. Our main character is Homer. He is an orphan who has been brought up at St. Cloud's, an orphanage in the United States. He's born in the 1920s. The novel is set just before the Second World War, mostly and partly shortly after the end. The orphanage of St. Cloud's secretly performs abortions. Dr. Larch is in charge of the orphanage. He performs the abortions. When women come to St. Cloud's, they either get an abortion or leave behind an orphan, and Homer is one of those orphans who was left behind. It starts off kind of nice. You get Dickens references. Charles Dickens obviously wrote a number of novels about orphans. Homer grows up reading those novels. He also reads Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Another orphan, Melanie, even though she at first seems to hate Jane Eyre, is quite inspired by it. It's interesting. It's nice to have those references. Homer is fairly likable at first, but then things start to get a little bit hard to believe, unrealistic. Dr. Larch chooses to train Homer as a doctor, which, although Larch is a doctor, he has no authority to train doctors. He teaches Homer how to be a midwife. He teaches Homer how to perform abortions, although Homer never actually performs an abortion under Dr. Larch. He is taught how to do that. Homer is allowed to practice basic medicine. He is allowed to deliver babies. But Homer has no formal medical training. He has no legal authority to do so. He is in fact a teenager as he's doing this. That in itself is a little bit hard to swallow. This is, after all, the 1940s when Homer begins to do these things, and in the late 30s, early 1940s, you can expect that there would be some sort of oversight. This orphanage, St. Cloud's, has hardly any oversight at all. We're not sure how many students are there, but we have a doctor and a couple of nurses who look after them. But the question of their education seems to be neglected. There seem to be very poor educational standards, very poor career training standards. These children who spend most of their lives at St. Cloud's, if they are not adopted, don't seem to be prepared for the real world in any way. For example, we have Melanie, who is mentioned being in her early 20s, and she is still at the orphanage. She is not working. She is not learning to support herself. She is at the orphanage, and there doesn't seem to be anyone looking out for her in particular. Not only is this orphanage performing abortions that you assume are illegal, they're performing abortions under the radar, but births don't seem to be properly registered. Even deaths in some cases. There is a particular death that occurs, and you assume that this child has had both his birth registered and his death registered, but Larch is able to use this boy's identity after this boy's death, and no one is any the wiser for it. Then Irving gives us a couple of bizarre love triangles. We get one that occurs fairly early on, between Melanie and a boy at the orphanage. Melanie crosses state lines. She flees, searching for her lover who has left her, and she suddenly, quite suddenly, without warning, gives up and settles down with a woman, which I can definitely believe that Melanie would perhaps be lesbian, perhaps be bisexual, but the fact that she just suddenly gave up on her lover, I found a little bit hard to believe. We get another love triangle that occurs. There is a woman by the name of Candy. Two men are in love with her. We don't know why they're in love with her. She seems to have a very flat personality. She doesn't aspire to be anything or go anywhere. She just seems to exist. She is a very flat character in that regard. But this particular love triangle is never resolved. Irving never has her make a choice. We never get an answer to this predicament. I probably could have overlooked these things, could have enjoyed the novel, if it hadn't been for a massive time jump that we suddenly get without warning. The Second World War has broken out, our characters are in the midst of it, and then suddenly Irving gives us a 15-year time jump. Suddenly we turn the page and we're on a chapter and it says 15 years later. This time jump comes out of the blue. It's unexpected and it breaks the flow of the story. I don't mind time jumps in the novels I read if it's done well. I was reading another novel at the same time, I Loved You More by Tom Spanbauer. Lots of time jumps in that novel, but those time jumps are done well. We expect them. They don't break the flow of the story as Irving does when he does this time jump. This time jump, of course, takes us to, I believe, the late 50s, and the issues in the novel earlier on become suddenly more problematic. We still have this orphanage without very much oversight. But then we have an extremely ridiculous ending to the novel. We have a character who decides to assume another person's identity and become a doctor, even though there's no formal medical training. This character assumes the identity of another character who had died as a young child. This child who died obviously had no formal medical training either, which is a little bit hard to swallow. And this character becomes a full-fledged doctor. Now, if Irving actually expects us to believe that the novel could end in this way, then of course Irving must foresee that the only possible next step in this story is for the entire staff of St. Cloud's to be arrested and to lose their jobs, and this character who assumes the other character's identity would of course spend a very, very long time in prison. That's the only logical way for this story to resolve itself, because I just can't buy this ending. And of course, in this ending, Irving conveniently seems to forget this love triangle that he had established earlier on, never resolved. What it comes down to is that this novel, the writing was just okay. The writing didn't inspire me, the writing didn't draw me in. The writing was average. There were no beautiful moments in the writing, nothing I was underlining. What it comes down to is that there were believability issues. The characters were not likable. What it comes down to is that if you're willing to suspend your disbelief, if you're willing to invest yourself in a character, a main character who, upon meeting a woman for the first time, collects a lock of her pubic hair and stores it in his wallet, then this is the novel for you.